Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It is morning here, my time. It is afternoon in Ash's time. But thank you either way for joining us today. We have a really exciting presentation. If you have been here before, you have probably seen our other presentation with Maze, and they are incredible. Everyone always comes out just so fascinated with what they can do. Ash, I cannot tell you how many people were so mind blown when you were like, you can run on unmoderated testing or like moderated testing with Maze through Zoom, and people were like, "Wait, it didn't even occur to me that you could do that." That like everyone was like setting up their tests like separately. So like, yeah, everyone was just like, "Oh my god, I can't believe like I didn't think of that." But yeah, hello, welcome, welcome. Oh, we have everyone from everywhere. We have Atlanta, Minneapolis, Austin, Uruguay. Oh, that's amazing. Thank you for joining us today. Oh, from Saudi. Awesome.
Oh my
Yay.
goodness. Yay.
Yeah, everyone from all over the world. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's likely the time that we're doing this so everyone else in the world can join us at the end of their day. But yeah, cool. So thank you all again so much for being here. I am Emily. I am the community manager for Design Lab, and I have Ash Oliver here with the Maze team. And then hiding in the chat, we also have George, also from the Maze team. During the presentation, George and I will be fielding questions. George will likely take over questions related to Maze. I will answer questions related to Design Lab. And then at the end of it, we will also take questions from the questions tab. So if you do have questions about, excuse me, the presentation, go ahead and toss them in the questions tab. And then George and I will kind of answer along the way. If not, we will kind of save certain ones to be answered live by Ash towards the end. But I'm going to hand it over so Ash can introduce himself and then we can get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate it. It's so great to be back at Design Lab, and hello to everyone that's in the audience. I'm actually going to just put myself on no video just so we can make sure that the presentation is coming in clearly, and then afterwards I will jump back on video. So let me turn that off, and then I'm going to share my screen here. Shout out to my boy George in the chat. George works on the customer success team, so he's going to be an excellent resource for you as we're going along. Let's make sure we can see this here. All right, let me know, Emily, is this coming in clear?
Yep, we're perfect.
All right, cool. All right, everybody. Well, like I said, thank you so much for taking the opportunity to connect with us today. So the topic matter that I'm going to speak about is in regards to rapid testing. If you haven't heard about rapid testing, it allows you to be able to apply a method and framework for your research and usability testing within your product organization. So we're going to go through kind of a few things today. First and foremost, I just want to kind of set a little bit of the context around why the way in which we build products today is actually a broken process. So I'll give a little history and context to that so we understand kind of what we're facing as challenges from a product team perspective. And then I'll introduce what rapid testing is, both from a definition, a practical definition that you can walk away with, but also a framework that you can start to incorporate into your process. I'll actually break out of the deck halfway through and I'll give you just a little product tour. If you haven't seen Maze at all, this will be a great kind of one-on-one overview. If you have seen Maze before, there's a few tricks up my sleeve. So I'll be able to show some new things that might be new to you. And then we'll finish up by talking a little bit about adoption tips and tricks. And as Emily mentioned, if there's any carryover questions from the audience, happy to take those at the end. All right, so just to dive in here, I think this is a great slide to start with because it ultimately kind of breaks out the workflow or process from a very high level of what teams are typically going through today. And for those of you in the audience, this is really applicable to any product person. You might be a product marketer, you might be a product manager, you might be a designer, a researcher, a UX writer. It ultimately is anyone that touches that product experience process. And this is inherited. And the reason I say it's inherited is because over the last 20 years, product development, the way that we actually build products, has largely transitioned from waterfall to agile. And it's ultimately come about through not only the Agile Manifesto and how things have changed into that development process, but also from startups really adopting lean methodology in order to deliver products at a much faster rate. So we've increased the ability to deliver with speed, but what has been inherited is still kind of that siloed methodology from waterfall. So we come up with an idea, which typically happens, kind of inside the organization, which then informs design from that solutioning standpoint, which then goes into context. So that might be engineering to build the product, or it might be product marketing to be able to kind of put the content around the product or experience, and then we release. And that's largely still the same as it ever was. The speed has certainly improved, but the way in which we learn in this process has not really improved. So if you kind of look at this spectrum, when we're learning typically happens after release. And then we come back to the drawing table and we iterate, and we go back to ideation and then designing and providing some of the content and context around it, and then releasing and learning. And ultimately, this is a super painful process because we end up having about 50% of engineering time spent on rework, because that's when the learning happened after release. And the cost of that is not just for development, but for the entire product part of the organization is really costly. So when we think about the ways in which we can incorporate research and testing to ensure that we have confidence, we've informed our ideation and our concepting with user experiences or user insights at the beginning of the process. The reason why this is typically not done is because research is still a really slow, limited, and expensive process. So teams are typically, regardless of where you are in the kind of curve of adoption towards research or testing, teams are pretty much utilizing or scraping together limited data. This is typically coming from more moderated one-on-one kind of research interviews that are happening. It's really slow, especially to do moderated types of research practices, because you have to do all of the kind of sourcing of those individuals, setting up all of the sessions, conducting the session, extrapolating all of the insights and notes and context from that, and then sharing that across the team. And that whole procedure is typically pretty expensive. So on average, it's usually around $12,000 to complete a research study of that magnitude. Teams don't really have that kind of budget. As I just mentioned, with more of that agile and lean methodology in place, you have to be able to move very quickly. And the budget and the speed doesn't typically align very well to be able to do this at scale, especially when we look at kind of the construction of product teams. Researchers to designers and developers, researchers is usually a 1 to 5 to 50 mix. So if you think about all of the engineers and designers who are looking for that kind of customer insight or voice of the user to inform their process of product development, the researcher is really taxed because they're only one person to every 5 or 50 within their counterparts. And then another kind of internal challenge is just the buy-in from stakeholders or just culturally across your organization. 42% of companies don't collect feedback from their customers, which is a huge number when you really think about it. Like, where are these ideas coming from, if not from customers? It's pretty staggering to think that almost 50% of those companies are not making those product decisions based on the feedback and experience from their users. So this is kind of the landscape today. And as product makers, we know that in order to build successful digital products, we really need to be informed by the user. So the closer we can bring our product team to the user, the better. The more successful we'll be in launch, and obviously the more value we'll bring as an outcome to what we build. So rapid testing is really the framework in order to invigorate your teams with a much more scalable and practical way of being able to conduct research and testing. So what is rapid testing? Well, ultimately, rapid testing is the decision-making framework that's applied. So when you think about the original slide there, when each kind of stage of the product development life cycle is happening, where those decisions are being made, and being able to inform that decision-making process with the input from users is everything that rapid testing encapsulates. So the real fundamental goal is to remove the guesswork in building digital products, or take the decision making that's happening outside of the organization in order to ensure that you're relying on insights, you're making those decisions based on the input from users at every step of the process. And ultimately, the point in the workflow, every point in that process becomes a point of decision making. So it's a testable input that you can actually use to validate problems, concepts, designs, copy. All of these things can be incorporated from this rapid testing model. So in order to kind of look at this from that development process, you can kind of break down those parts of the workflow into testable inputs that you can actually learn from at every stage. So examples that you might be able to apply here would be like, which feature idea should we even build? Or is this user flow working or optimal? Is the design easy to use? I mean, this really can encompass a wide range of questions that ultimately get answered by those users in that input. So you can see kind of that the testing process begins with a testable input that has been identified. And then you're able to kind of move into that testing in order to ensure that the next stage of the process is informed by what you learned in the former step of the process. So if you learn something ultimately from idea to design that completely skews from your original conception, then you're able to rework that way up front in the process instead of avoiding all of that rework once it's released. So when you break this down a little bit further, ultimately the rapid testing framework is encompassed by what we call iota loops. If you're familiar with Greek numerals, which actually George in the chat, very familiar with Greek numerals. He's a Greek guy, so he can speak to this in more detail. But the iota is the smallest input possible. So it's in the rapid testing framework, it's the smallest, most meaningful iteration loop. I know it sounds kind of meta, but when you break this down, it ultimately is encompassed by input, objectives, tests, and analysis. So when you think about input, this is really like, what decision do we need to make that needs to be tested? That's what I was talking about before, like which feature idea should we build, or which message speaks best to our audience. Objectives are which quantifiable metrics should we reach in order to validate that decision. So we start with that question, what do we need to validate? And then the objective really defines how are we going to be confident in validating that decision. So what quantifiable metrics do we have there in order to validate that? Then you actually set up the test. So you know what you're looking to answer. You know how it's going to be validated. The test is really the setup process to be able to collect the actionable data, and hopefully at scale. If you're kind of adopting this throughout your organization, that's a key component of ensuring that your testing is scalable. And then finally is the analysis part. So when you get to the analysis part, there's going to be a lot of kind of synthesis that you can draw from based on your test. But ultimately, the analysis is, was the objective achieved, or do we need to test again? So if your analysis doesn't align with that quantifiable metrics that you identified at the objective state, then it's time to retest. And the analysis part of the data is really assessed in order to determine the next steps. So I think that's kind of a good way of putting that into practice, is that the analysis confirms that you're able to move forward in the process. This is what helps safeguard against all of that downstream rework that happens once you release and then learn. So that's the rapid testing framework ultimately in action. I want to show you what it looks like when you apply a tooling or instrumentation to be able to facilitate this process, and ultimately Maze does that. So I'm going to break away from the deck here. I'm going to jump into a little product tour, and then we'll come back to the deck afterwards just to finish up on kind of a synopsis of these things. So let's get into Maze first here. So a Couple of things to know about Maze. And when you launch the product, you're going to get your kind of dashboard where all of your tests are able to be broken out. You can actually collaborate with users to be able to spin up these tests. So when you're collaborating with stakeholders across your organization or counterparts within the product organization, you can all kind of jump in on the tests in one place. But there's two main types of Maze tests that you can run. The one side, Maze user testing, might be what you're more familiar with. This is all hinging around a prototype link. So it integrates with all of the major design tools, Adobe XD, Figma, InVision, Sketch, Marvel. And it allows you to embed that prototype link in the Maze test and then construct that Maze around the prototype. So it's really good for usability testing, for design validation. If you're looking at validating jobs to be done, for example, within the prototype, any of that kind of early on low fidelity wireframing all the way through high fidelity prototype testing is really best suited for this kind of Maze. The other side of Maze is what we call Maze discovery. And this is really open-ended. It can be applied across really the whole of the product organization, not just design. This is great for surveys, market research, idea validation or concepting with users, potentially idea generation or brainstorming. You can really incorporate anything from 5-second tests to card sorting activities, tree testing, which is really great for information architecture, kind of hierarchy of how things are organized, what that findability looks like, and then a whole variety of other survey-related blocks, question blocks, as we call it, which can be woven together to be able to really complement what you're looking to validate within that discovery phase. So I'm going to jump in just to show you a couple of ways that we can create this test. I'm not going to go through the entire thing because it's super easy to do, but I want to give you a general idea of how you'd be able to spin up a test. So I'm just taking a prototype link here. This is just a pretty simple prototype that I have in Marvel. And I'm going to paste the link here in the Maze user test. And then you'll see that there are 3 main sections to Maze. So first section here on the left-hand side, this is where you're going to construct your test from end to end. So you can see there's kind of these 2 bookends, the welcome screen, the thank you screen, and then everything in between is what you're going to construct. And all of these blocks, as we call it, are really just components of your test. So for this first one, for example, you can see this is a mission block. And a mission block is really oriented around a task. So you're looking to validate a flow or journey or task to be completed in that prototype. So in this case, I'm just going to say that this is the getting started menu. You can provide context around kind of orienting the user around what you're looking for them to do. But the really important thing here is setting up the expected path. And the reason I want to highlight this is because when we see the actual quantitative data at the end, the results, the expected path is kind of a key KPI. It's going to give you the validation around how many users actually went through that expected path, or happy path as it's sometimes called, and validated that flow, versus the ones that maybe went around that path. Maybe they didn't follow it exactly as you had carved out. They ultimately may have still achieved success, but went about it in an indirect way. And then the third KPI ultimately is the ones that had no success. They completely bounced off. They were not successful. So in this case, this is a pretty simple flow. I'm just going to click through the initial screens, and then we're going to say that once the user selects getting started, we're going to call that successful or achieved. Now, as a follow-up, I might have like a quick yes/no question here. Maybe this is asking how easy was the getting started menu. I'm not necessarily doing this to best practices because we would probably want to frame that question a little bit different language, but gives you an idea of how we can spin this up. We can add any contextual notes. We can even cross-reference an image if we want to. We can change it from icons to emotions. pretty customizable here. But the reason that I wanted to show a yes, no block is because you can actually incorporate conditions, and conditions are going to allow you to branch those users off. So in a close-ended question like this, where you ask how easy was it in the getting started menu experience, those that select yes might continue on with the rest of the tests because it was pretty easy. Those that said no, you might want to prompt for more fact-finding. So what specifically maybe did they find challenging? And so we can add an additional block there, and that way any of the users that select no can then be prompted with that additional question before they resume the rest of the test. So a whole bunch of different blocks that we can incorporate here. I'm going to show you what one looks like kind of fully built out, and then what the results look like. But before I do that, I just want to show you a quick preview, because I think it's pretty easy when you go to actually turn your maze live. It's going to give you options of how you're going to be able to socialize that test and get that into the hands of your users. So a whole variety of ways that you can do that. The most predominant way is to simply take the maze link, and then you can use that in your email to users specifically, or maybe post that on social media channels in order to gain feedback from the users that follow you on those social media platforms. But the templates here are really fabulous. If you are feeling like a little lost, what can I test? How do I spin this up? There are tons of templates that have been built largely by experts in the field. So Maze actually partnered with a bunch of product managers and user researchers and designers to be able to construct templates that you can reuse. So you can, of course, review these and then make any applicable changes specific to your company or what you're looking to validate. But it really spans the gamut from content testing and copy testing to concept validation, satisfaction surveys, usability tests, wireframing tests, and even depending upon what part of the org you sit in, whether it's product or research, design, marketing, they're all kind of organized here for you to easily adopt. So pretty great if you want to jump in and kind of see what's available to you in templates. So let's take a look at that same test that we were just creating. This is one that's been built out already. And we actually, you can see here, it's been tested with 112 users. So pretty great as far as the volume of statistical significance that we then gain just by testing with that many users. If you can kind of compare that to moderated testing, 112 sessions for moderated one-on-one interviews would be pretty time consuming and possibly not achievable at that magnitude. So in this case, what we're doing is we're looking at the results. So I've got a bunch of my stakeholders here that can also review the results. I'm going to get to the report in a second, but the three main ways that you can see the results of your tests are by the results category here, the testers category, and then the report, as I mentioned. So the way that I like to look at this as far as the two toggle here is results is really looking at everything in aggregate. So across all of the blocks that we created for this test, this is all of the 112 user responses all together across every block that was created for that test. The testers panel is going to show you everything in more of a micro view. So results macro, testers micro. And the way that this is broken out is really great to be able to isolate users. So perhaps if there's something that you want to drill into more specifically, whether that's really interesting feedback or maybe an outlier, you can see what that tester did from start to finish in the entirety of the test. So you can really start to isolate behaviors down on the individual level should you look to do so. I'm going to look at the walkthrough menu here because this was the block that we just created. And remember, I was talking about that happy path that you're constructing, or happy paths, actually. So there might even be more than one way to achieve success. Maybe if you think about resetting your password in an app, there might be more than one way to do that, and you might be testing that flow overall. And so there might be more than one path that you're actually testing within one maze test. Ultimately, we're only looking at one path here. But what Maze is doing is it's showing you the volume of users that achieved direct success. So they followed the path exactly as you had identified. The volume of users that had indirect success, achieved what you were looking for, but didn't go about it in that same path. And then the bounce rate, so the ones that did not achieve success. So really great success on this first flow. Makes sense. It's pretty easy. But you can see that 95% of the users that tested had that direct success. And we can even get into more specifics here if we start to look at the heat map, for example. We're going to be able to see exactly where users are clicking. We can isolate down by clicks. We can figure out, what users went into which particular sections. We can even see the KPIs up here on the top. So really granular data that we can start to garner right from our unmoderated testing sessions. And again, everything is just going to be broken out by block. So you can see all of the aggregate results by block. Now, the thing that I love the most is the report. And there's a few reasons why I really love this. One is because a lot of the teams that I interface with typically are coming together with their broader team to have some sort of sharing of knowledge as to what happened with the test, what was the success or failure of the test, what did we learn? And usually with a lot of tools, regardless of if you're doing something moderated or unmoderated, that construction of the results, synthesizing what does it all mean, putting it all together in some sort of kind of deck format or presentation format, and then being able to share it with your team is part of that analysis process that's sometimes a little bit laborious. And so Maze actually constructs this automatically in a deck format for you. And I can share this with my team super easily. You can see here, I can even start to have that Discord right on the deck. So all of my stakeholders, counterparts on the team, were able to jump in here and start to make sense of the results, all in the same place in which we could even present the results. Now we orient the data in a little bit different way here, and I think it's really interesting how these stats are kind of consumed, because what you'll see here is that first mission block that we went through, that walkthrough screen. We know that was really successful because we saw 95% of testers that went through that flow achieve success. But Maze actually calculates a usability score here for you. So if you even look at, okay, these are the metrics of the success for that first mission block as compared to the second mission block, much less success here. And you can see, obviously, the usability score is much different. So it really starts to put tangible, actionable insights into play, which is really, really helpful. Again, looking at, kind of more of the scalability and faster pace of Agile. This is how you're able to actually incorporate that research and testing muscle into your workflow without hampering the team or siloing, that kind of process only to the researcher. So you'll be able to digest all of this insight. And I would say, playing around in here, you can really start to see where it's even actually suggesting things, so rising certain things to the top for designers and product managers to be able to really identify what's the most important kind of takeaways from here. So in regards to this flow here, we're not only seeing, okay, this is what the performance was, but isolating each screen, like the third screen and the fourth screen, higher performing than the first two screens. So really now we're narrowing in exactly where our focus should be. So teams are able to kind of action the results that they see much more quickly. Okay, so that's a little bit of a lap around Maze. Let me get back into the deck here just to finish up. All right, and I'm going to leave you with a few things to think about, because ultimately, rapid testing should change the way you design and build products. And I probably could have another presentation solely on like where are you on the maturity curve with testing and research practices within your organization, and maybe if you're a part of a really big organization, that might look very different for your team versus a different team. But the practice of rapid testing really allows teams to be able to make research more of a team sport. So it's not segregated to just the researchers. It doesn't remove the researchers from the process, but it allows teams to be able to collaborate on making validated decisions, having confidence in what they're building, and ensuring that they are learning from users at every important step in the process. And everybody's doing that, not just a couple of people within the team. As a proxy, that democratizes the data within your organization. So if everybody's kind of in this together as a team sport, then everybody's on the same page and ultimately can access that information in an ongoing process. So democratizing that information outside within the organization to other teams is really helpful. And obviously Maze as the report is just one way that you can do that. And kind of the bigger piece to all of that is being able to build this institutional knowledge. So when you think about, kind of the process of testing and research, where does this information live? Who has access to it? Who does what with it? And how are we able to compound this learning moving forward? Instead of just having, a project-based kind of method or approach to research where we have certain people in the organization research it, and then it kind of lives with that project and maybe no one else kind of sees the fruits of that labor. Instead, we're bringing everyone together to be able to socialize this more broadly across our product teams and hopefully build on that institutional knowledge. So everything that you're learning and gaining from these tests just continue to compound in value over time. So a couple of tips and tricks. If you are looking at incorporating more of this framework and methodology, a few things that you can take away from this is, first and foremost, learning how the decisions are actually made on your team or in your company. Just do some investigative work. I mean, you probably already know this, maybe just haven't spent a ton of time thinking about it. And again, there's probably a whole myriad of how this is happening and kind of where you are in the maturity curve might inform how those decisions are being made. Everything from like up in the ivory tower, just the C-suite making decisions versus, really co-creating with your users kind of on the other end of the spectrum. So understand how those decisions are being made. You can be a voice of reason and activism, so to speak, within your team to relay the value of testing. It's what leads to more successful products. Everybody wants that. So really championing that information and kind of spirit within your team will help convey the actual value of it and get people out of the mindset that research is slow and costly and time consuming and not worth it. This really helps to kind of help break away from that old guard thinking around research and testing. Third thing you could do is engage the entire team. It's kind of by design to do that in a more democratized and team sport kind of methodology. Really, it's not as hard as you might think. You don't need to necessarily win over everyone on your team. You just need to bring a little squad together that really believes in that, and that will radiate out from there. So try to engage the entire team and don't just kind of be a wallflower with it. I love the idea of creating a dedicated community. I've seen really creative ways that teams are doing this. Everything from like fans of or friends of, these are like power users, evangelist users, early adopters, whomever within their user base that are just really keen on utilizing the product. They are vision customers or users. They're dedicated to giving you constructive feedback, and harnessing the power of that community is, I think, key to really co-creating products that have value for users. So if you don't already have that, there's lots of ways that you can do that, but creating a community is a great step. And then lastly, just building that testing muscle. I've spoken with a lot of teams that even just using Maze, for example, for one test can illuminate a lot inside the organization. So building a testing muscle, all you got to do is get started. So those are some tips and tricks that you can take away. I want to leave you with this last quote. Is kind of one of my favorites from the president by Deloitte. And ultimately, he says that the single biggest driver of business impact is the strength of an organization's learning culture. I think that's pretty profound. I don't think that we hear a whole lot about organizations talking about how they learn. I think we hear a lot about what they're doing or what their competitors are doing or what features they've launched and all of this, kind of process and methodology, but we don't often hear a lot of organizations talking about the strength of how they learn. And I believe that is the competitive advantage, and certainly the competitive advantage moving forward into the future as we start to see even more of a crowded digital space. This, I believe, is the thing that's actually going to separate organizations in the future. So if you want to check out some more resources, May's blog is a great place to go. There's really tactical, thorough guides that are created with Maze. If you haven't checked out the Maze site and kind of toured around in some of our resources, it really, I know I'm kind of biased because I obviously work for Maze, but truly remarkable resourcing there. So feel free to check that out. And thank you so much for spending your morning, afternoon, evening with me. I will turn it over to Emily, and we can maybe finish up with some questions.
Yay, this was incredible. I always feel like I learn something new every time I get to hear one of your webinars, Ash. So thank you for this. We actually have quite a juicy question in the questions tab. So I'm actually curious about this answer. So Samantha's asking, can you talk more about balancing the dedicated community idea with engaging the entire team? Feels like there may be some tension there.
Ooh, yeah, that is a juicy question, and I love it. Yeah, no, you're right. There's sometimes a reticence to getting close to users by certain members of the team because maybe they've had a really poor experience before. Maybe their thinking is more along the lines of, it's just going to be feature request after feature request, or it's not going to be constructive. There's a whole myriad of reasons why that might be a little bit of a sensitive thing for some folks on the team. I think the way to balance that is to highlight what it does look like in practice, meaning, try to change people's perceptions in not telling, but showing. And even if you could do that in a very small way, I think that they start to come around and realizing like, wow, the success of my job actually can be in a greater magnitude if I am closer to my users. And the way in which I engage with those users might be through this community kind of aspect. There's a lot on that. I think one of the great examples, and it might not be super accessible because it is a French company, but I'll just share a little story, is Doctolib is a product for physicians. And so their user base are all doctors. And they have really taken on their community in a co-creation of their product. So they do everything from like researchers will hold monthly workshops with a selected group of users to be able to go through like the genuine, this is what we're struggling with as a product team in regards to shipping this feature, to we want to get your insights on these wireframes, everything from maze tests that are sent out into the community to garner that, and elicit that response. I mean, there's a ton of practices, but I think in order to get the balance right, you kind of have to show what's possible.
It's like almost like showing, right, like vulnerability from like a company standpoint, like transparency, and also that we mentality, right? Like it's not like, oh, we just want your feedback and then we'll just like do whatever, right? It's like, no, like we're making this for you and we want it to be useful. So let's actually work on this together, right? So it's almost like collaborating together.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Cool. Hopefully that answers your question, Samantha, and hopefully that gave some insight to other people who may be kind of like treading waters with like, how do we get people to do this thing that we need from them? All right. So this one's from Carlos. So are users expected to volunteer for testing, or how much is normal, to pay them for their time? And does this tool help measure their participation?
Oh, great question. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways. So not every test is necessarily going to fall into the same process. So I know some teams that for certain tests will compensate, and maybe that's through like gift cards, or I've seen teams do things like with like a coupon code for their product, or some sort of maybe even swag. I mean, there's a whole lot of creative ways that you can compensate. But I think the measurement is like, how much are we expecting from the team? If it's something that's like a pretty, mild survey, maybe you don't need to compensate for that at all. If it's something that's going to be a little bit more time intensive, usually compensation is kind of the key, and you can really span the gamut. I think it's best to look at your history within the organization to say, are we like on track to what we've typically done, or is this a brand new practice and we kind of get to set the expectations? Yeah, a lot of teams, I mean, it certainly depends on if they compensate or not. But I think the barometer to check is like, how much are we asking of the person in order to get their feedback? And as far as sourcing it, there's tools out there that are more on the recruitment panel side of things, mostly from that moderated perspective, that you might be able to partner with to get access to users within certain demographics or segments that you're looking to test within. Or the best way is with your own users. How you might be able to access that might be, depending upon your organization, it might look a little bit different. But yeah, compensation can be creative, and I'd say it's just about the volume of the ask.
Time is money, right? It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
Samantha's asking if you could maybe type the name of that French company you mentioned in
Oh yeah.
your answer earlier in the
Sure.
chat. And then while we do that, I'm actually going to turn Marissa's question into a not a yes no question, but I'm going to turn it differently. So Marissa's asking, do you think Maze is a great tool to use for beginners in UX and UI? And I'm going to flip it and ask you, why do you think it's a great tool for beginners? Yeah.
Yeah, great flip. Yeah, I mean, so I guess just a little bit of a personal note. I'm a self-taught mostly designer, and the tool itself is super approachable. I'm remembering way back when I first entered into design and was like very intimidated by Adobe Suite and even Figma early on. I don't think you'll have that sense when you approach Maze. So it's very easy to get up and running quickly with it. But the power behind it is just as significant. So I would say that's the reason why I really love it, because it's not one of these like lowbrow tools that might be quick and snappy, but doesn't provide much value. It's got really important significance, but it's incredibly easy to use. So beginner, even better, because now you're going to enter into the space with this kind of theory and importance and practice, and you can bring that into all of the teams and organizations that you're a part of moving forward. So yeah, for sure.
All right, and then follow up to that. Let's say someone, they're new to design, or maybe they're a solo designer at a company who's never had design. How do they convince, or I guess in your opinion, like how do they convince the company, the business, that like Maze is a great tool to invest in, and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably I'd go back to figuring out like being in that investigative mindset within your own organization. I think is really the best way, because I could propose a bunch of options, but it may not land specifically for your team or stakeholders. And I think the key is to like take that investigative approach and think about, okay, this is what my stakeholders care about. They care about shipping on time, or they care about making sure that we, have user success, or we, ship features that aren't dead in the water. Everybody wants to make sure that they don't ship something that nobody uses and nobody wants. Figure out like what are the key things that they really care about, and then start to align, like whether it's Maze or any other tool, this is the way in which we get there. If you can show them what they're challenging, what they're challenged by today and what motivates them, and then align that with how you're able to compensate for that with a tool, that's usually the best approach to getting someone's attention and really seeing the value of why they would invest in it.
Yep, always comes back to business value all the time.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, it is a Maze question, but less about the product itself. Lisa is just asking who created the UI for Maze because she's very inspired by it all.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, yeah. We get that a lot actually, which is funny. If you saw, I can't remember what like website it was. I think it was awards, maybe the AWWW, if you know that site, awards.com. I think it Maze, the site was just featured on it with a bunch of others because it's mostly 3D. So Romaine, George, I don't know if you remember the name. Roman, I think is the name, but I can't remember the agency, but we have some internal folks. So shout out to Stell, who is the designer on the Maze side for the brand studio. So Stell, in combination with a few other partners, have created the new Maze brand, which I think we launched it back in like January or February of this year. So
It's a while.
yeah, I know the time is ridiculous. Thank you for the shout out. That's so nice of you. Yeah, it's a cool brand.
Oh, okay. So Carlos is just diving right in. I love this. How is tester participation measured with Maze?
Participation measured. Well, I mean, I guess it would depend. Like, are you thinking about like you send it out to 50 people and nobody takes the test? Or are you thinking about like participation in terms of like what they did in the test? So maybe all 50 people take the test, but you get kind of lackluster responses or maybe half answered responses. I guess I could kind of answer in both of those ways, but I guess the way to look at it with Maze and inside the product, you're able to see exactly what that end-to-end experience looks like from every tester. So for example, like a really great way of just kind of like weeding out maybe people that aren't the best fit for this is to see like, okay, we've taken 3 tests or whatever, and this particular user time after time is skipping through the test or not providing any constructive feedback or, skipping questions, whatever. Maybe you isolate that person and don't test with that person anymore. You can see that very clearly in Maze. So you can see the individual participation. If you're talking more about like holistically participating because you send out a test, to 50 people and nobody really clicks on it, I would say, again, think about, is it a right calibration with compensation? Are you asking someone to spend 45 minutes and not giving them anything for it? And like, think about how you're positioning it. It actually does make a difference. Like, we're inundated with messages, asks, feedback surveys, all of this stuff. Our inboxes are overflooded. Like, try to transcend being a human who really cares and have that come through in your tests, like the copy, the actual way in which you create your questions, to the email that you're sending out or the social media post that you're putting out there with the test link. Those really do go a long way. And I mean, you can test that. So you can test what copy works, but I would say like if it's kind of coming from a cold start, like this, your users haven't really been engaged in this way before, don't set your expectations so high that then you're just left to feeling disappointed, because they have to build that muscle too. Like, you might be earlier on the curve and starting to incorporate this. You don't want to be blasting your users constantly. Like, you do want to show up that you want their input, but they have to be kind of, welcomed into that circle as well. So think about it from both perspective, and just try to be a genuine human. And I think you'll get more responses than you anticipate.
Yeah, I cannot stress that enough. Like, it's that human piece. It's the, try to have a conversation with someone, even though you're not actually having a conversation with them, right? Like, that's really how you get them to stay engaged, at least in my experience.
Yeah, sure.
All right, cool. So I think that was it with all the questions. Ash, any parting words for our group here before we kind of call it a day?
I think the parting words, if you go, I'm not really going to have the parting words at the top of my head, but there was, I just retweeted something that if you work in startups or you're trying to get into startups, it was just very like wholesome and nice to read from someone. I just retweeted it, so you'll see it on my Twitter if you go there. But basically, it's just like, hey, remember that we're doing really incredible things here, and like startups especially, like doesn't have to be so high stakes. Try to laugh with your team, and stay as positive as you can be, and remember kind of the bigger picture. That's ultimately the essence of what that tweet was. I'm butchering the exact language, but it was so nicely packaged. So if you're in startups, that'd be my parting words for you. But other than that, thank you so very much for having me again on Design Lab, and really great to connect with everybody from all over the world. Love being here.
Thank you so much, Ash. And thank you, George, so much for answering all the questions in the chat and in the questions tab. You killed it. But yeah, thank you everyone so much for being here. This is recorded, like I mentioned earlier. So feel free to share the link. It's going to be on our YouTube channel later on. And then Maze is also going to share all the wonderful stuff later on as well. So yeah, thank you, Ash, again. Thank you, George. And hopefully we'll see everyone next time.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank
Take care.
you. Take
Bye.
care. Bye.